Okay, let's dive in. We've got a really fascinating set of sources today, all looking at this, well, this truly hopeful idea that science is actually finding ways uh, to literally rewire traumatic memories.
Yeah, think about that for a second. What if those really painful experiences, the ones stored deep in your brain, didn't have to, control your life anymore?
Exactly.
That's really the core mission of this deep dive, isn't it? To look at these groundbreaking steps in treating PTSD and trauma.
Right, and focusing not just on managing symptoms, which is important, but on actually modifying the distressing memories themselves.
Our sources really take us to the cutting edge here. They get into what these memories are, how they get sort of stuck.
Or maybe hyperactivated.
Yeah, hyperactivated is a good way to put it. And then exploring the therapies, the medications, the brain science, all offering these new pathways to healing.
It really paints a picture of why there's more genuine hope in this area than maybe ever before.
So when we talk about traumatic memories, what do the sources say makes them different?
Well, they're not like remembering what you had for breakfast, right?
Definitely not. The sources highlight how they get deeply imprinted, particularly in the amygdala.
The brain's fear center, the alarm system.
That's it. And instead of fading or getting filed away neatly like other memories, they can stay hyper-vigilant. They get triggered really easily.
Triggering flashbacks, anxiety, all that intense distress.
Right. It makes them feel less like something that happened in the past and more like a danger that's happening right now.
They sort of invade the present. But the really exciting thing from these sources that we're developing pretty sophisticated ways to, well, interact with that specific problem.
Often using the brain's own ways of dealing with memory.
Exactly.
What's really fascinating looking at these sources is how the approaches seem to target the memory's impact, how it's stored, how it's retrieved, not just dealing with the emotional fallout afterward.
Yeah, they explore different angles, like working directly with how the memory is processed.
Like EMDR, is that one of them?
Yeah, it is, yeah. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. The sources explain it uses guided eye movements.
Or sometimes tapping, right? Other bilateral stuff.
Right, other bilateral stimulation. And you do this while bringing the distressing memory to mind.
Okay, and the thinking behind that, according to the sources.
Well, the theory seems to be that this back and forth stimulation helps mimic what goes on during REM sleep.
REM sleep, when your brain is naturally processing the day's experiences.
Exactly. So it seems to help the brain kind of shift the memory.
Yeah.
Move it out of that stuck high alert state in the amygdala.
And integrate it better into the wider network of memories.
Precisely. Making it less raw, less emotionally charged. More like a story about something that happened, not something that is happening.
And the sources mention it can even be effective virtually, which is pretty interesting given the mechanism.
Yeah, that is interesting. So it's like helping the brain finish a process that got disrupted by the trauma. Okay, but then the sources also talk about memory reconsolidation therapy. Now, this one sounds almost unbelievable. Like you can actually rewrite a memory. How did the sources describe that actually working?
Okay, this is where the brain science gets really intriguing. The sources explain that when you recall a memory, it doesn't just pop up perfectly preserved, like a file from a computer.
Yep.
It actually becomes unstable again for a short time. Temporarily labile is the term they use.
Like wet cement.
Exactly like wet cement, before it gets stored again or reconsolidated. And this therapy specifically targets that brief window, that moment of instability.
So pulling the memory out actually makes it editable for a short period before you put it back in the filing cabinet.
That's a great analogy. The sources describe using techniques during this labile phase, often introducing new information, maybe a different perspective about the original event while the memory is active.
Like what kind of new information?
It could be visualizing the trauma differently, maybe focusing on the fact that you're safe now in the present while recalling the past threat. The brain then reconsolidates the memory, but it incorporates this new element.
Updating the fear response.
Essentially, yeah. Updating the fear response linked to it. It's not about erasing the memory, the sources are clear on that, but modifying its emotional punch, how easily it gets triggered.
Wow. Modifying the actual template. Okay, and then there's another one mentioned. Trauma contextualization. How does that fit into this picture?
Trauma contextualization, as the sources describe it, seems to focus more on helping the brain tell the difference between the past threat and present safety.
How does it do that?
It involves carefully exposing patients to cues, maybe sounds, smells, situations that used to trigger their trauma response.
Whoa, hang on. Deliberately activating those triggers?
Yeah.
That sounds kind of risky, counterintuitive.
It has to be done in a very controlled, safe therapeutic setting. That's absolutely key. The sources stress that. And the idea is that this helps the brain learn to contextualize the memory, to recognize that the trigger cue right now doesn't actually mean danger.
Ah, I see. So the smell of smoke doesn't automatically mean fire everywhere now.
Exactly. Over time, the brain updates that association. It weakens that automatic, overwhelming fear response. It's really about reestablishing a sense of safety around things that became terrifying reminders.
Okay, so we've got these therapies working with the memory process itself, but the sources also highlight possibilities with medication. How do drugs play a role here?
Well, the sources talk about medications that can influence the actual chemical processes behind memory. Things like formation, retrieval, reconsolidation.
Like chemical tools to help the rewiring process along.
You could think of it that way, or sometimes directly interfering with the problematic memory pathways themselves.
Okay, so what kind of drugs are we talking about?
For instance, the sources bring up rapamycin. It's an mTOR inhibitor. And the research suggests it might interfere with the proteins needed to actually retrieve certain fear memories. So it's kind of like putting a chemical block on recalling the most distressing versions.
Blocking the retrieval.
Oh, wow.
And propranolol. I usually think of that for like blood pressure or stage fright.
Right. It's a beta blocker. But the research in these sources suggests it can also interfere with that reconsolidation process we were just talking about.
Ah, the wet cement phase again.
Exactly. Specifically, it seems to weaken the emotional charge of a memory when it's recalled and then restored.
So the facts of the memory stay, but the panic associated with it gets dialed down.
That seems to be the idea. Less emotional intensity would be huge.
Definitely. And memantine, that's another one mentioned.
Yeah, memantine, often used for conditions like Alzheimer's. The sources suggest it might help the brain create new connections.
Neuroplasticity.
Potentially, yeah. Helping form new non-traumatic associations, or maybe helping the brain effectively update or overwrite older problematic ones, possibly through things like neurogenesis, growing new neurons.
But the sources are careful to say these aren't magic bullets, right?
Absolutely. They consistently frame these medications not as standalone cures, but as tools. Often tools used alongside therapy to make the therapy work better.
That makes sense. A combined approach, hitting the problem from different angles.
Okay.
Okay, so if we bring this back to the brain itself, what are these therapies and medications fundamentally trying to fix or restore, according to the sources?
Well, connecting the dots here, the sources explain that trauma basically throws the brain's balance out of whack. The balance between its automatic, sort of defensive circuits and its more conscious cognitive ones.
Okay.
Trauma cranks up those deep implicit memory systems, the ones tied to immediate threat, in places like the amygdala and hippocampus. But at the same time, it can dampen down the prefrontal cortex.
Which is responsible for it.
Explicit memory, our sense of time, context, the narrative of what happened.
So the immediate gut reaction overrides the conscious understanding.
That's a great way to put it. That stuck feeling people describe comes from being constantly thrown back into that raw, fearful, implicit state.
Right.
So therapies and medications, by changing how memories are accessed, processed, or stored, are basically trying to dial down that overactive threat response from the defensive circuit.
And let the cognitive circuits, the prefrontal cortex, get back in control.
Exactly. To allow the memory to be integrated into your life story as something that is over, not a constant present danger. And that, in turn, reduces PTSD symptoms.
That gives a really clear picture of the neurological goal. Now, this all sounds incredibly hopeful, but what challenges do the sources point out? It can't be simple.
No, definitely not simple. Despite all this progress, challenges remain. A big one is personalization. Treatments really need to be tailored because everyone's trauma, everyone's brain is unique.
Makes sense.
The sources also stress how often PTSD overlaps with other issues like substance use disorders.
Yeah.
So treatments need to be comprehensive, integrated.
Treating the whole person, not just one symptom.
Right. And just basic access to these specialized therapies can be a huge hurdle for a lot of people.
Yeah, availability and cost.
Okay.
So personalization seems key. And looking forward, the sources mention something really interesting. Using tech like machine learning.
Yes. And here's a specific detail from the sources that really jumped out at me. Machine learning is showing incredible promise, potentially helping diagnose PTSD with, get this, Nearly 90% accuracy.
Wow, 90% accuracy,
Yeah.
just based on analyzing data points.
That's what the research suggests is possible. It could completely change how quickly and accurately people get the help they need.
A faster, maybe more objective, data-driven diagnosis.
Exactly. And that paves the way for treatments that aren't just generally effective, but truly tailored, specifically to you and the unique way trauma has affected your brain.
Okay, so let's pull this all together. What's the big takeaway from these sources about where trauma treatment is now and where it's heading?
I think it really shows this powerful shift, We're moving beyond just teaching coping skills, which are still vital, but moving towards actively working with the brain's own mechanisms to modify the difficult memories themselves.
Right. We've seen how therapies like EMDR, memory reconsolidation, trauma contextualization, are aiming to help the brain process and, in a sense, rewrite these memories.
And how the medications mentioned, rapamycin, propranolol, memantine, can target specific parts of that memory process, like retrieval or reconsolidation, often boosting the effects of therapy.
And the underlying brain science points towards restoring that balance, right,
Yeah.
between those deep defensive circuits and the more conscious cognitive ones.
Yeah. And looking ahead, the potential for tools like highly accurate machine learning and diagnosis, well, that could mean treatments get even more precise, more individualized.
So the message seems to be that trauma doesn't necessarily have to be this life sentence, defined by inescapable memories that keep hijacking the present.
Exactly. As science unlocks more about how memories actually work, neurologically, real healing seems increasingly possible for more people.
Which, stepping back, raises a pretty profound question, doesn't it? If we get to a point where scientific understanding and intervention can genuinely rewrite or significantly change these deeply embedded traumatic memories at a biological level, and we know our sense of identity, who we feel we are, is so tied up in our collection of past experiences, what does this future of targeted memory modification mean for our fundamental sense of self?
That's definitely something to think about, something to mull over as you reflect on where all this could lead.